and promoting for years.
Mr Speaker, the reason, Mr Heatley, that the Housing New Zealand waiting list hit 10,000 when Labour was in government was because your lot hocked off 14,000 state houses to your developer mates when you were in government in the 1990s. So let's be clear where the blame lies for the waiting list. And unlike National, Labour doesn't hide the need by slashing the waiting list, by slashing the waiting list. We did have 9 years. We managed to rebuild nearly 9,000 state houses in those 9 years, Dr Smith. Well, this bill signals the beginning of the end for Housing New Zealand, and let's be clear, that is what this bill is doing. National's reviewable tenancy policy is an utter disgrace, and you can tell that National MPs don't appreciate how privileged they are to enjoy security in terms of their tenancy, in terms of that they have a home, and they clearly don't understand that not every family in this country has that privilege. They take it for granted. And the reason housing is so crucial is because it provides stability. Families can put their roots down, they can get involved in their local community. They don't have to live in fear of not knowing where they're going to live from week to week, from year to year, of not knowing what schools their kids are going to be going to, how many times they're going to be transient. And transience is one of the biggest killers of educational achievement in this country, Mr Speaker. Too many families in this country don't have the stability that they need, that Phil Heatley and Dr Nick Smith take for granted. They don't have it. They're growing up in households that are transient, and that is bad for our country. So what we have is one government department. We have one government department in this country that has the ability to provide that stability that families need. One, and that is Housing New Zealand. We have a unique opportunity to do something incredibly important for families through a government department, and the National Party is stripping that away. What an incredibly cruel thing to do, to strip away from the one government department that can provide the crucial element of stability that is missing from so many children's lives in this country. Reviewable tenancies also are a cruel solution to fix what is a non-problem. This is a non-existent problem. And that's, in 2011, I have to point out that Phil Heatley said it would only apply to new tenants and that he would exclude the elderly and the infirm from that because it would be distressing for them to know that they would have to go through that process. Well, that's gone now. Apparently, we knew back then, we said 3 years ago, it's only a matter of time before this is extended to everyone, and that's exactly what has happened. This is a non-problem because Housing New Zealand tenants were already being reviewed annually for their eligibility for the income-related rent subsidy. And where their circumstances had changed, tenancy managers, remember those where we used to have people who actually looked after and developed relationships with these families, the tenancy managers would work with that family to move them on. And overwhelmingly they did. But when I talked to tenancy managers, do you know what they said was the single biggest issue in terms of moving those families on? It wasn't that they refused to move, like the National Party is trying to tell us, it's that they have nowhere to move to. Nowhere to move to. And the National Party is saying, how dare they have the audacity to not want to be homeless? How dare they dig in and say, I don't want my kids living in a garage. They have nowhere to go. Fix the issue of housing supply and this problem goes away. And in a way that doesn't undermine the stability of every family living in a Housing New Zealand house, currently particularly where there are children in those families. The other thing this does is it scares tenants away from taking on extra hours at work because they don't know what that's going to do to their eligibility for a home. So where in the past they could go to their tenancy manager and say, for 2 months I've got more work, let's discuss it, and know that that wasn't going to lead to them being evicted, now they don't have that security. So people are going to turn down hours at work for fear of losing their home, for fear of being made homeless, and the National Party expect us to believe that this is a good policy. As I said before, we don't have tenancy managers anymore in Housing New Zealand, and when Phil Heatley was Minister, he changed the eligibility for state housing so that it went from your inability to find housing to your ability to find housing, and the test changed, and it seemed like a small change at the time, but let's be clear about what it did. What it meant was that the solo mother that I met, who went to Housing New Zealand where they told her the best thing she could do because she technically had the ability to find housing now, and that test had changed, the best thing she could do was to stop paying her rent in the private rental she was in, get herself evicted, and then she would be eligible for a Housing New Zealand property. That's the scheme that Phil Heatley put in place. That's the scheme that the Honourable Dr Nick Smith is continuing here. Or the homeless man in the shelter in Auckland who was told that he was considered housed because he was in the night shelter. That's the Housing New Zealand policy that this government has brought in. It's cruel, It is callous, and it's all part of a plan to destroy the tradition of social housing in this country, and this bill continues that. Let us be very clear that that is exactly what this does. And I now want to come to the issue of the extension of the income-related rent subsidy to the community housing sector, because, yes, this is something they've been asking for a long time. Again, let us be clear. The money that has been provided in this budget, when it's fully rolled out, will cover less than 20% of those properties currently owned by the community housing sector providing social housing. So they currently provide around 5,000 houses. 17% will qualify for this. That's all the money that there is. So that's not even considering any new housing. So when Phil Heatley goes on about, oh, they can do much, much more in the area of social housing, well, Mr Heatley, you haven't even provided enough money to cover what they already do. In fact, less than 20% of what they already do is covered by this. And Annette King asked a very important question of the Minister last night. She asked, is the reviewable tenancies policy going to apply to those tenants that are receiving an income-related rent subsidy who are now going to be housed by the community housing sector? And we had the answer in the New Zealand Herald this morning where a spokeswoman said this would include tenants in housing owned by community groups wherever the government is supporting them through income-related rent. So yes, where someone is on an income-related rent in a community housing social provider home, when they reach market rent, they are going to have to evict those tenants. Now, I don't know if the Honourable Dr Nick Smith has met with many of these providers yet. I know Phil Heatley did, and he knows how strongly that sector believes in secure tenancies, how strongly that sector believes in the stability that secure tenancies provide. And I note that Community Housing Aotearoa co-chairperson Lisa Woolley said that her own agency, Vision West Trust in West Auckland, had a policy of long-term tenancies. Quote, it's all about making sure the family is stable, connected to their community, that their children are going to the same schools. So what a cruel blow for a sector that has been calling for the extension of the income-related rent subsidy for a long time, to then be told that alongside it, they have to implement a dreadful, callous policy of evicting tenants when they reach a market rent issue. Because let me give you an example. Take someone with a mental health issue. Phil Heatley thought it was okay to evict people with mental health issues. In fact, he relished in it. He relished in evicting mental health tenants. I had a tenancy manager say to me, you know what, when we had a mental health patient who went into crisis and the neighbours rang us to say, look, this person's going a bit crazy, we used to call an ambulance, now we call a police car. That's the difference. And they said when the ambulance or the mental health advocate turned up at the property, the neighbours would say, what can we do to help? When a police officer turns up, they say, how can we get rid of this person from our community? That's the current situation we have. So if I come back to the example of a community housing provider that supports people with mental health issues, so they provide wraparound support, and I completely agree that they will do a better job than Housing New Zealand do, of providing support for tenants with mental health issues. So they get that person to a point where they're well enough to take on extra hours at work, where they're well enough to start working full-time. So that person now no longer qualifies for the income-related rent subsidy. But that provider knows that the minute that wraparound support is not there, they're going to go backwards. Well, the National Party says, evict them, we fix the problem, it's okay. What we know and what the community housing sector knows is it's not that simple. That just because someone is doing better doesn't mean that's always going to be the case, and that wraparound support needs to be there. And the community housing sector have said for a long time they don't want to do the government's job for them. They want to be in partnership with the government doing it as well as, not instead of. And what this legislation sees is the government saying, well, you can do our job for us now because we no longer see a serious role for the state in providing social housing. And an effective partnership between the government and between the community housing sector would see a strategic farming out of tenancies, basically. We could see tenancies being transferred to organisations that have specialist needs in social housing, whether that be dealing with the elderly, whether that be dealing with formerly homeless people, at-risk youth, whether that be mental health patients, looking for providers that can do that in a way that Housing New Zealand can't, and strategically moving those tenancies over, all those properties over, instead of what we're seeing here, which is holus bolus, just shoving 12,000 houses, evicting 3,000 people. Because I don't think the National Party realises they can evict as many people from Housing New Zealand properties as they want. They don't just disappear. Those people have to go somewhere. They don't just disappear into the ether because Honourable Dr Nick Smith has evicted them from a Housing New Zealand property. Fix the problem of housing supply, and all these non-problems that we're trying to fix in this bill go away. This is a cruel, callous piece of legislation, but expected from this government.
I call Mike Sabin. Mr Speaker,